name is Janessa Jacobs. Welcome to my coronavirus classroom. This is the endocrine system. So we will go over a lot of information about the endocrine system in just a moment, but before I move my lovely assistant, I thought I would introduce you to the major endocrine organs of the body. So the hypothalamus is the master controller of the endocrine system, and it sits right here in the diencephalon and exerts its control over the pituitary, which is the master gland, and would be sitting here, but it's over in my model on the other side. If we look back here, this is the pineal gland, which secretes melatonin and is in charge of regulating your circadian rhythm. Here we have the thyroid gland. It sits on the anterior aspect of your trachea. What we don't show here is a gland called the thymus. It's really active in kids and gets involuted throughout adulthood, which means replaced by fat. If we look back here, sitting on top of the kidneys are the adrenal glands. They have an outer glandular cortex and an inner medulla. This is the pancreas that has both endocrine and exocrine functions. And then our gonads are also considered endocrine glands. The testes, which produce testosterone, and the ovaries, which produce estrogen. So we will talk a lot more about each of those organs. We'll also see that hormones are released all over the body, but these are the specific endocrine glands. Hello, I'm Janessa Jacobs. Welcome to my coronavirus classroom. This is the endocrine system. The endocrine system is one of the two major controllers in the body. The nervous system, which you should have talked about last semester, is the body's first and kind of fastest controller. The endocrine system is the body's other major controller, and it controls longer-term homeostatic variables such as growth and reproduction. So it's just as important as the nervous system, but gets a lot less attention because you can't feel the effects as quickly as you can, like, I don't know, say flex a muscle, which is under nervous system control. So let's begin with our kind of a comparison of the two systems as controllers. So as far as the endocrine system goes, we can say that the endocrine system is going to control longer-term homeostatic variables, such as feeding and reproduction, growth, whereas the nervous system controls shorter-term homeostatic variables like flexing a muscle or increasing or decreasing heart rate really quickly. Some kind of rapid change is happening through the nervous system, so this is shorter-term homeostasis. Some other things about the two systems. They both use chemicals, and the chemicals have to be really specific to interact with target cells. So that's a similarity, but the endocrine system is using hormones that are chemicals that are released from glands into the blood. And the nervous system is using neurotransmitters that are released from neurons just across a small distance of a synapse. So the endocrine system uses hormones that dump into the blood, and the nervous system uses neurotransmitters, which I will abbreviate as NTs, that cross the synapse. So endocrine system, since our hormones are being released into the blood, the endocrine system can have really widespread effects and have lots of different targets. The nervous system really has really short kind of short distance signaling, and is having kind of short distance, less long lasting effects because the transmission stops as soon as our neurotransmitter is degraded or reuptaken. So another thing that we can say about endocrine signaling is that it is widespread signaling that can affect many targets. And in the nervous system, our signaling is pretty localized because it's just happening right across that small distance, the synapse. So the effects of hormones are going to be a lot longer lasting, like the growth of the body. I mean, think about it. The difference between testosterone and estrogen, both hormones, pretty big. Males who have testosterone grow really big. They get a lot more bone and muscle. Females who have estrogen and progesterone develop in different ways. So that's a really long-term effect, and that's what the endocrine system does, really long-term effects. Your nervous system does short-term effects. What you control, you know, like contracting a muscle, is really quick. Or if we need to increase our heart rate because there's an emergency, that's really quick. So the endocrine system is going to be using glands as its primary organ. And we talked last semester a little bit about the different types of glands that we have and introduced you first to exocrine glands. Exocrine glands, if you remember, we find in like the skin as sweat glands or in hair follicles, sebaceous glands. Exocrine glands have ducts and they release their product onto an epithelial surface. So these are ducted glands. And we could say that the gland empties the product empties into a duct that empties onto an epithelial surface. So we'll talk more about exocrine glands. We'll see that the pancreas has both endocrine and exocrine functions. So we'll talk about the exocrine functions of the pancreas when we get to the digestive system. What we're going to focus on now are endocrine glands. And endocrine glands are ductless glands that release their product, which is a hormone, right into the blood. So our endocrine glands are ductless, and they release hormones right into the blood. So all of our endocrine glands are highly vascularized, and that's because our glands need to be able to produce a hormone and release it right into the blood. So exocrine glands, ductless, ducted, empty onto an epithelial surface. Endocrine glands, ductless, empty into the blood. All right. So now we're going to talk about chemical messengers. We're really only going to talk about hormones right now, a little bit about neurohormones. We're not going to go into great detail about our other kinds of chemical messengers until we get to the immune system. But your book brings it up now because we're talking about chemical signaling. So let's go ahead and talk about chemical messengers. So hormones, as chemical messengers, are long-distance signals that are released by a gland and can have targets anywhere where there's a receptor for that hormone. So hormones, these are long-distance chemical signals. Okay, hormones, long-distance chemical signals released by glands into the blood. They can affect potentially any cell in the body. So they can affect widespread targets, but we'll say they can affect any cell with a receptor for that hormone. The next type of chemical message that we have is what are called, or chemical signals, chemical messenger that we have, is what's called an autocrine. Autocrine signals are signals that are produced by a cell, and then it's going to bind a receptor on that cell's surface to cause like a message to self. So if we look at this, auto means self, and crine is referring to like a chemical message. So this is a chemical message to the self. So autocrines are like messages to self, where we could say they're released by a cell and bind to a receptor on its surface. So this is important in immune system activation, as we'll see when we get to the immune system. So autocrines are like messages to self. And then we'll paracrines when we get to the immune system, and para is like near, and crin, again, a chemical signal, near or next to, and so paracrine messages are going to affect neighboring cells. These can be released from virus-infected cells, let's say, and it's like a message to all the neighbors, like upregulate your antiviral properties. So paracrines are released from a cell and have an effect on all of the neighboring cells that have receptors. So, all the neighboring cells with receptors. So receptor specificity is really important. So hormones, long-distance signals that are sent into the blood. To be a target, you have to have the right address. So a hormone can affect any cell in the body that has a receptor. Autocrines are released by one cell and affect that cell itself. We'll see that in the immune system. This is like a note to self. Paracrines are released by a cell and bind to receptors on neighboring cells. Those we will also talk about when we get to the immune system. So those are our three types of chemical messengers. Here's a quick question for you. Endocrinology involves the study of the endocrine organs and blank. A, hormones. B, neurotransmitters. C, paracrines. D, autocrines. The answer is A, hormones. Okay, hormones. So how do we classify our hormones? Well, we classify them based on their chemistry and also kind of based on where they're released from. So the hypothalamus is nervous tissue that releases neurohormones. Our glands are glands that release just regular hormones. So that's one way we can classify our hormones. But we also classify them based on their chemical composition, which is going to be important because it can help us know some things about solubility. So we have two different big classes of hormones. We've got amino acid-based hormones and steroids. So we'll say these are modified amino acids, peptides, or proteins. So amino acid-based steroids are modified amino acids, peptides are proteins, and then steroids are all based on what's called the cholesterol nucleus. So you get cholesterol and you start tagging on all these different functional groups all over the place, and that gives you your different steroids. So for our steroids, we'll say these are based on cholesterol. And so this is going to be important when we think about solubility. So amino acids, peptides, and proteins are water soluble. So in general, most of the time, they can freely transport in the blood, and they're going to bind to extracellular receptors. Steroids are based on the cholesterol nucleus, which means that they are lipophilic, so they can slip right through plasma membranes, so they're going to need an intracellular receptor, and also they can't just float around free in the blood, so they're going to need a transport protein. There's also one modified amino acid that needs a transport protein. We'll talk about that in just a minute, but this is kind of the first way that we will talk about our hormones. And when we get to the end of this, you might feel a little overwhelmed because we're going to have this huge list of hormones. So you're going to think, how am I going to be able to organize this in my head? And remembering solubility and where it's coming in from and all that stuff. So I'm just going to tell you a secret right now for your back pocket. Steroids only come from two places, technically three, but the adrenal cortex and the gonads, so the ovaries and the testes. So that's it. So anytime you're wondering, what is the chemical class of this hormone, just ask yourself, where did it come from? Did it come from the thyroid? If it came from the thyroid, it must be amino acid based. Did it come from the brain? If it came from the brain, it must be amino acid based. Did it come from the testes? Ah, it's a steroid. Did it come from the zona fasciculata? Ah, it's a steroid. So steroids only come from the adrenal cortex and the gonads. Well, they bind to receptors on target cells, and that's what makes a cell a target for a hormone, is that it has a receptor. So not every hormone has targets all over the entire body. Some do, like insulin, cortisol, but some don't. They've got just really specific targets. So what makes a target cell a target for a hormone is that it contains the specific receptor for that hormone. Target cells contain specific receptors for hormones. And so it's also possible that cells might have receptors for multiple hormones. And in that case, if both hormones are bound to their receptors, we could have some interactions. So we'll talk about that in just a minute. So that's the first thing to be aware of, target cell specificity. All right, what else? How do our hormones work? Well, our water-soluble hormones don't require a transport protein. So blood is an aqueous solution, so our water-soluble hormones can float freely in the blood, but they can't get through the plasma membrane because it's a phospholipid bilayer. So they are going to interact with their target cells through extracellular receptors. These are called G-protein coupled receptors, and you'll probably go over them in a lot more detail in some other class. Hopefully you already went over it in Gen Bio. We don't have time for it right now. But what we're going to say about our water-soluble hormones is that they float freely in the blood and bind to extracellular receptors. Float freely in the blood and bind extracellular receptors. Now, what does this mean? If this is my phospholipid bilayer, so this is my cell membrane here, and I am a water-soluble hormone, then I'm going to bind to a receptor on the cell surface, and that's going to cause a cascade of events to occur inside the cell, and I'll activate this little G-protein coupled receptor, and what's going to happen is that I'll start pumping out these things called second messengers. The most common second messenger pathway is the cyclic AMP pathway. And what happens is that the G-protein coupled receptor that you're activating, the G-protein is the G-stimulatory protein, and it comes across and it activates this other protein called adenylate cyclase. And adenylate cyclase starts cycling out cyclic AMP. So cyclic AMP is the second messenger that's going to cause a cascade of events to occur inside the cell. So you might have just one hormone molecule bind to its receptor, but because I produce a bunch of cyclic AMP, I can go on and I can turn on protein kinases and start speeding up chemical reactions. I can signal, like the nucleus of the cell, to start producing a protein. I can turn on, like in the case of thyroid hormone synthesis, when thyroid stimulating hormone binds, I trigger the production of thyroglobulin. I turn on a sodium iodide symporter in the basal surface. I turn on an iodine pump on the apical surface. I turn on iodinating enzymes, and I just do this huge cascade of events inside the cell in response to just this one hormone binding here on the surface. So water-soluble hormones are going to just be able to float around freely in the blood. They don't require a transport protein, and then when they get to their targets, they're going to bind to these extracellular receptors that cause the production of second messengers. All right. What about lipid-soluble hormones? So lipid-soluble hormones are all of our steroids and thyroid hormone. Thyroid hormone is actually a modified amino acid, but its modification is that it gets these iodines stuck to it. So thyroid hormones are collectively called thyroid hormones, but really it's T3, where we have 3 iodines, and T4, where we have 4 iodines, and sticking all those iodines on there messes with the solubility. So our lipid-soluble hormones are all of our steroids, which came from where? And thyroid hormone. Lipid-soluble hormones are thyroid hormones, which I'm going to abbreviate as TH. These are T3 and T4, triiodothyronine and tetraiodothyronine, and then and our steroids. So now these are lipid soluble, so they cannot float freely in the blood, which means they require a transport protein, and they're going to be able to slip right through the plasma membrane, which means they're going to bind intracellular receptors. So for our lipid-soluble hormones, they require a transport protein, and they bind intracellular receptors. So, they bind this intracellular receptor. How does that work? Well, our lipid-soluble hormone is going to slide right through the plasma membrane, and then it finds its receptor and binds to it, and then slips through the nuclear envelope, actually binds to DNA, and changes gene transcription. So think about it. Testosterone is a steroid, and males get a lot more bone and muscle development. That's what makes them taller and generally stronger than females. So testosterone is changing genetic expression. It goes into the cell, binds to the hormone response element on DNA, the testosterone response element, opens it up, and changes gene transcription. So what we can say about our intracellular receptors is that they are going to alter gene transcription. So for our lipid-soluble hormones, we could say that the hormone receptor complex enters the nuclear envelope, or enters the nucleus through the nuclear envelope. Nucleus binds to the hormone response element on DNA. And alters gene transcription. So the effects of our lipid-soluble hormones are going to take a little bit longer to see. If you think about it, in our water-soluble hormones, I could bind to my extracellular receptor and cause the release of that second messenger, which would cause a pretty immediate cascade of effects, like, say, the release of another hormone, like, pretty darn quickly. But with my lipid-soluble hormones, since what is happening is that I'm going in and altering gene transcription, it's going to take a little bit longer to see the effects of the steroid hormones. Okay. So, here's a question for you. Steroid hormones are synthesized from A, proteins, B, peptides, C, cholesterol, or D, amino acids. You're right, the answer is C, cholesterol. So, if you have any questions or want to rewrite that stuff down, you can just rewind a second and play it again. Slow it down to about 75% and you'll be good to go. Okay, here's another question for you. Any given hormone will influence the activity of A, all tissue cells, B, all target cells, C, its second messenger cells, D, all effector cells. Okay, so the answer is B, all target cells. Any given hormone will influence the activity of its target cells. It won't affect all tissue cells because not all tissue cells are going to have receptors for every hormone. And not every hormone uses a second messenger. Our steroids and thyroid hormone don't use second messengers. Those are lipid-soluble hormones, so that's just a good distractor answer. And then all effector cells, that's kind of a weird way of thinking about target, or that's just another distractor answer. So the answer is all target cells. So how can we get a hormone to be released? There are three ways that endocrine glands are going to be able to be stimulated. Either humorally, neurally, or hormonally. So what is each of these types of stimulation? So first, if there's our body's fluids are our body's humors. So your blood is your humors. So humoral stimulation of a gland means that the gland is paying attention to something in the blood or the absence of something in the blood. It's just the blood that it's paying attention to. So if you have something in the blood that is going to trigger the gland to release its hormone. That's humoral stimulation. So what's an example of that? You've probably heard that insulin helps you uptake blood glucose, or you release insulin when your blood glucose is high. So your pancreas is paying attention to how much glucose is in your blood. If your blood glucose goes up, that's an increase in glucose in your blood, so that's humoral stimulation of your pancreas due to increased glucose levels. So, humoral stimulation. Something in the blood stimulates the endocrine gland to release a hormone. Humoral. Something in blood stimulates the gland to produce its hormone. I should say in or absence of something in the blood. Because the other thing is, if your blood glucose drops, you have this hormone called glucagon, also released by the pancreas, that will stimulate your liver to release stored glucose, so that your blood glucose can come back up until the next time you eat. So that's still humoral, because it's the absence of glucose in your blood that's stimulating the pancreas. So humoral stimulation of a gland just means that the gland is paying attention to what's going on in the blood. Do I have something that's too high? Do I have something that's too low? Now I'm going to release my hormone. So humoral. Something in the blood stimulates, or the absence of something in the blood stimulates the gland to produce a hormone. All right, what about neural? Well, this is when a neuron stimulates the release of a hormone. So we already talked about this last semester when we talked about the sympathetic nervous system and its activation of the adrenal medulla to release norepinephrine and epinephrine. So that's the best example of neural stimulation. We'll just go with that for now. So for neural stimulation of an endocrine gland, we could say a neuron stimulates the gland. And so, for example, the sympathetic nervous system stimulating the adrenal medulla is an example of neural stimulation, where a neuron from your sympathetic nervous system is directly stimulating the adrenal medulla to release epinephrine and, to a lesser degree, norepinephrine to the blood. That's neural stimulation of an endocrine gland. And finally, this is how most of our glands are going to work, where we have hormonal stimulation. I guess I shouldn't say most. A lot of our glands are going to work where we have one hormone stimulates an endocrine gland to produce another hormone. So for hormonal stimulation, one hormone causes the release of another hormone. Or I will say stimulates the gland to release another hormone. So really, when we think about like the pituitary as the master gland, it's releasing a bunch of hormones that are going to go out and stimulate the other glands hormonally. So, one of the things that we said about target cells is that what makes a target cell a target for a hormone is that it's got receptors for that hormone. I mentioned then that it would be possible, or it could be possible, for a cell to have receptors for multiple hormones, which would mean that that cell could be a target for multiple hormones. And if both receptors are bound, what's going to happen? How are the hormones going to interact? So that's what we're going to talk about now, hormone interactions. So when one hormone is bound to the receptor and another hormone is bound to the receptor, what happens? The first interaction that we have is a type called permissiveness. And in a permissive interaction, one hormone permits the actions of another hormone. So in permissiveness, one hormone permits the actions of another hormone. What do I mean? Well, so if you think about it, all during the first half of the female ovarian cycle, estrogen levels are going up. And that's stimulating thickening of the uterine lining and all of that. But another thing that it's doing is it's increasing progesterone receptors inside the uterus as well. so that as soon as ovulation occurs and progesterone starts going up, the uterus is ready. It can bind to that progesterone and get really thick, and so hopefully a fertilized oocyte can bury right into there. So the example will say, for example, estrogen permits the effect of progesterone by increasing progesterone receptors all throughout the first half of the ovarian cycle. So, for example, estrogen, which is abbreviated E2 for estradiol in humans, estrogen permits the activity of progesterone, which is abbreviated P4, by increasing progesterone receptors on the uterus, specifically on the endometrium of the uterus. Okay, so estrogen and progesterone interact permissively, and that's because estrogen permits the effects of progesterone by increasing progesterone receptors on the endometrium of the uterus throughout the first half of the ovarian cycle. We will talk more about that when we get to the reproductive system. Okay. Another type of interaction we can have when a cell has a target for multiple hormones is synergism. And in synergism, what happens is when two hormones are bound, the response is amplified at the target. We met synergism in the sympathetic nervous system. We said that the sympathetic nervous system, using neurons, was releasing the neurotransmitter norepinephrine that was increasing heart rate and increasing respiration rate and all of that. By increasing epinephrine and norepinephrine from the adrenal medulla, those hormones could then synergize with the nervous system and increase the sympathetic nervous response. So you already know what synergism is. But how it works in a hormone sense is this is when multiple hormones are bound to their receptors on a target cell, and we amplify the response at the target cell. So synergism. We'll say that the effects of hormones are amplified above and beyond additive when both hormones or all hormones are bound to the same target. So what's an example of this? Well, thyroid hormone, we will see, increases metabolism in cells. So it just kind of enhances anything that's going on. So growth hormone increases growth. So when kids are developing, they have high levels of growth hormone. But let's just say 1 unit of thyroid hormone usually causes 1 unit of growth. So on its own, if thyroid hormone is bound to a target, it would cause 1 unit of growth. And let's just say that 1 unit of growth hormone, all on its own, would usually cause 1 unit of growth. So, all right, well, what happens when both hormones are bound to the same target? Then what would happen is that we would have like 3 units growth instead. So it's above and beyond additive. Instead of having 2 units growth, we get 3. Now throw testosterone into the mix, and oh man, let's say it usually causes 1 unit growth on its own. Throw that in the mix, you get something like, I don't know, 5, 6, 7 units growth, who knows. But that would be another example where those are synergizing. So, yeah, in synergism, when we have multiple hormones bound to their receptors on the same target cell, the effects are amplified above and beyond additive. Okay, and then last, we wouldn't really see this like happening, like you wouldn't expect to see this happening on a moment-to-moment basis in the body where you have antagonistic hormones being dumped into the body at the same time, because antagonistic hormones or in the antagonistic interaction is when the hormones have the exact opposite effect. So I already kind of told you about this when talking about blood glucose levels. Insulin lowers blood glucose levels. Glucagon increases blood glucose levels. So these are antagonistic because they have the exact opposite effect at targets. So antagonism. The antagonistic interaction is when hormones have the opposite effect at targets.